Good morning, everyone, and welcome to my talk, OpenAPI and Early Design Feedback Engine. So I don't want to go too much into detail about OpenAPI. We had like a full conference track about OpenAPI yesterday. I will not talk about the format because this isn't really relevant. But I just want to quickly talk about what OpenAPI enables so that we're on the same page here with what we're doing. So OpenAPI is a machine-readable format to describing APIs typically in a YAML file or in a JSON file. And that file is supposed to represent the single source of truth of what your API is supposed to look like. And you can generate OpenAPI in two ways. One way is you do an API design, and then either you write it manually or you use some visual tools to create that file. Or the other option is to create it from code annotations, even though I'm usually advocating for the design-first approach. And then the interesting thing is what you can do with it. And what most people know is that you can generate your reference documentation from OpenAPI, but you can do a lot of other things as well. So for example, you can create code in the form of like stubs for your server implementation, SDKs. You can do your input and output validation against the JSON schemas that you have in your OpenAPI file. And you can do a lot of tests and monitoring. So this is really what OpenAPI enables. And just wanted to give you this information so that we are on the same page here. Now I want to start with this statement: design greater than documentation. And before anyone gets offended and reads this as design is more important than documentation in a track where probably a lot of you are involved with documentation, bear with me for a moment. I will explain to you what I mean by this. I would even go like one step further and say design greater than documentation, greater than dev portal. And the reason why I'm saying this is that I think when you have a bad API design, then all your documentation can do is some sort of like damage control. Like if your API isn't intuitive to use, then what your documentation, what your technical writers have to do is like work around those things where the API isn't intuitive and kind of like explain those things. So you're doing damage control instead of like impressing the user in other way. And then the same thing goes, okay, if you have this kind of documentation, it's probably bad documentation. And a dev portal can only be as good as the content that you find on it. But the other thing is that if you have a good design and good documentation and a good developer portal, then that's basically like 3 opportunities to really impress your developers. And maybe another way to read this is you need all these 3 things, and maybe in this order. Like first you should care about your API design, then about the documentation, and finally about the dev portal. So this is really like to give you some motivation on why I think it's like really important to, with everything what you do in API, first thing you have to do is to get your API design right. And now I want to talk a bit about how to design an API. So when you get started, there are probably like a lot of questions that you have to ask yourself. And I think it's like really, really important before you do anything with your API to ask this. Like, who are our developer personas? Because there's a difference between like writing an API for like very advanced users or an API that you expect to be used in no-code tools or an API that you expect to be used mostly on mobile where performance is important. What are the API's use cases? Like that's like the most basic question. And sometimes people, they start, oh, we need an API for our system, and they don't really think about what that API should enable. Which data shall we expose? I think this is really important to when you think about it from a privacy standpoint, or also from a business perspective, like what do you want to expose to the API? API product thinking, I think that's like a really important thing. Like, will this API be a monetized product or whatever? And how does the API fit in our existing ecosystem, both in terms of like what other products and APIs do we have, but also in terms of like our backend architecture, like what will the API do? And just because there are so many questions about API design and different people, as you can see here in this quite diverse team, bring up different things, this is why I think it's like really important to get all the stakeholders involved. I mean, obviously, you have a product owner for your API, you have developers working on it, but there are a lot of other roles who can give some give some input into how this API should be designed. I mentioned technical writers, developer advocates, because I think it's like really important to get the people who will be doing the documentation done for the API, to not just let them do it at the end, but also involve them in the design, like for the reason that I just mentioned. And I really can't stress this enough. Talk about your developer personas. Talk about your use cases before writing an OpenAPI definition. Yes, the OpenAPI definition is your formal description of the API when you're doing API design first, but there's like a whole lot of things that come before that. Okay, so let's assume you got your team together, you talked about what kind of API you want to build, how you do this. Maybe you have done some domain modeling to have like a good idea of what needs to be there in the API. So the next thing is creating a first draft of your API in OpenAPI. This is how this could look like. And but I think it's like really important to understand whatever you've come up with, this is just like a first draft of your API. And change is inevitable. Like there will always be like something new. So now we've gotten our team back together. Think about this person here. They have written the API documentation, and now people come with all sorts of feedback. So just the one thing I mentioned, this would be difficult to explain in documentation. Like this is the technical writer's perspective, seeing the API definition and saying, okay, how can I explain this to users? Adding this field to the user collection endpoint would make my front-end code more efficient. I mean, yeah, sometimes only when you start writing an implementation, you see, okay, maybe this isn't exactly the best way to do this in the API. We should discuss preparing for an upcoming business requirement. Yes, future-proofing your API is important. And then obviously like small mistakes can happen, like this guy mentioned. I think we completely forgot the delete endpoint. So yeah, so again, bring your stakeholders together, collect feedback from them on your API design, but what these guys are doing, like all getting together, that just doesn't scale. So should this meeting have been an email, as they like to say? I would say, yes, that definitely shouldn't have been a meeting. I mean, maybe one meeting or so, but not for every change, because that just wouldn't scale. But maybe email is also not the best way to do this. So let's talk about a change management system. So what would be the requirements for such a change management system? So it should be a way to store your single source of truth for your API, your OpenAPI definition. There should be a way to suggest and compare changes. You should be able to build consensus within your team, and you should be able to review what has changed. Let's look at a source control system that maybe as developers you already use this, something like Git, where you can make changes by committing to your repository. You can compare the changes by looking at your commit history. You can have different branches in the repository to just have different versions evolving, and then you can accept changes by merging them. And this is just what Git itself allows. If you have some source code hosting like GitHub, they probably have like a lot of additional features that you can use here. So when I'm talking about using something like Git and GitHub for OpenAPI, some of you may think of docs as code and ask yourself whether that is docs as code. So docs as code is the idea of using the same tools that you use to manage your software, your code, to also use that for your documentation. And I would say, yes, this is certainly an analogy, but I really want to emphasize again that OpenAPI, yes, it's a form of documentation, but I call it like OpenAPI is docs plus X because you can do a lot of more things with OpenAPI. But yes, if you treat your OpenAPI file as documentation, that is certainly something like docs as code. So how could you do a workflow on GitHub? You could have your single source of truth in your main branch. And I would generally recommend like having a dedicated repository just for your API definition. And for suggesting comparing changes, you can use pull requests. And one way to do this is like to give different stakeholders branches where they can make the suggestions of, okay, like this is how we want the API design to change based on our requirements. And then you can make these pull requests. And you can build consensus by accepting and merging pull requests. I will talk about this in a moment. And through the commit history and by seeing the diffs, you can see how your API design evolves, and like everybody can be on the same page. So here's just like a very, very simple example of someone opening a pull request for this missing API endpoint, explaining, okay, this is why I think the design should change. So this is about giving good feedback to really explain why you want to do something. And then, like on GitHub, for example, you can also add the reviewers, and I will talk about this next, because like if you want to review a change, like if you like the processing of feedback is there's two things here. So one thing is what a reviewer should do. So I think a reviewer should ask themselves like these questions. So is this clear? Like, is this exactly the change that we need, or do we need to discuss this? Because I mean, some changes are just simple. Someone can suggest it and they can be accepted. Others maybe they actually need a meeting. Does the change make sense? Like, is the way that the change was made here, for example, the delete endpoint, the new one, is it like proper API design? And also, I mean, we're talking about early feedback here. It's like we're in the early stages of API design, but we can use the same process later. And I think then it's really also important to consider whether a change is breaking. And the other thing is that you should also think about, okay, who should be doing the reviews. You could have like a single authority. You can have like one person who's responsible for your API design, or you could have like something where everybody needs to accept it. Like we have like full consensus. But I don't think like these solutions are really scalable. So maybe a good approach is just to have, okay, maybe one or two people need to accept this, and then we can merge it into our main branch, and then this is basically the consensus that, okay, we want to change our API design. And yeah, when you merge something on GitHub, there you can see the OpenAPI design, and you see, okay, this is how our design has changed, and then you can add a review, you can have comments, you can communicate about this. So so this is really what I'm suggesting. When you do your API design, you give your stakeholders access in GitHub. This way you have an early feedback mechanism. And I'm calling it early feedback mechanism 1 because I think this really begs the question if every stakeholder that you have in your API, and I mentioned all these roles earlier, if they will use Git or if they even can use it. And so I want to make another suggestion. And before that, I want to quickly talk about using continuous integration, setting up a pipeline. For example, if you use GitHub, it could be GitHub Actions for your API definition repository. And I think there are a few nice things that you can do. You can check whether your API definition is valid. You can add some tools like Spectral, for example. That's quite popular to really see that, okay, even if maybe we need the human review to see whether we want to change our API design, we can at least validate that it is valid and follows our API guidelines. You can use this opportunity to run some automated tests, and you could even maybe set up a mock server. All these things you can do in your pipeline. But the interesting thing from what I'm talking about today is you can generate your documentation, your reference, you can use a tool like Redoc or Swagger, and you can automatically publish it. Like the same way, like from a deployment pipeline, you can deploy code. You can also use that to publish your documentation, and you can even do this like automated before you release your API, and that gives you the early feedback mechanism too, and that is your dev portal. And maybe this is mostly interesting for internal dev portals where you may not want to like show your API in progress to the public at large, but maybe you want to show it to people outside your team in your company. And the dev portal is a good way to do this because now you can have your API stakeholders review your API design and interact with it in two different ways. So one way is to work directly with the repository with your OpenAPI file. And the other thing is to just look at the dev portal and see the API in progress as it's all automatically published from your pipeline. And I think using your dev portal in this way prior to implementation and giving your internal developers the option to review incoming APIs, I think that gives much easier access and UI compared to something like working directly in Git. And if you combine this with setting up a mock server in your pipeline, you can even let your developers play around with it and build up some interest. And collect feedback. Now, the thing that you still need to do here is, because you have the, like with Git, you have the pull request mechanism, but on the developer portal, it's more like read-only, so you still have to design, okay, how will we collect the feedback? And that could be like setting up a mailbox for it, or some specific process to collect this feedback, but at least you have a way to communicate your API changes. And I think by giving this documentation preview, even before the API is implemented, that also means that your API backend implementation and all the things that you're doing in terms of developer experience, you can think them together and you can develop them together and build up the interest and do this. And I think thinking about these two mechanisms of review, you can also think of them as circles. Like you have an inner circle of stakeholders that you have directly involved in your API design, and they can work with your repository, they can make suggestions and changes. And then you build an outer circle of stakeholders, like the other teams in your company, and through your dev portal, you give them the opportunity to see the APIs as they are developed and give you some early feedback. Yeah, that's what I wanted to talk about today. I have one thing that I would like to mention, and that is that together with Josh Pondelat from Smart Bear, I have written a book about API design. It's called Designing APIs with Swagger and OpenAPI. And I want to thank Josh at this point also, because some of the things that I used in this talk, like some of the diagrams and all, he created them for the book. In our book, we have one chapter where we talk about this process that I just mentioned, like using Git, and we talk a lot about change management, but we also have like an introduction to OpenAPI and all. The one thing that we don't have in the book, just so that there are no wrong exemptions, this thing where I talked about today about using the dev portal and all, that's not there. But yeah, we talk a lot about change management for APIs. Yeah, and that's all from my side. Like if you want to stay in touch and give me feedback, maybe we have a few minutes for Q&A. Otherwise, yeah, follow me on Twitter. And due to recent events at Twitter, and also because even this morning in the keynote it was mentioned, yeah, you can also follow me on the Fediverse. And if you don't use social media, I'm happy to hear from you over email. And yeah, that's all from my side. Thank you very much.
I'll take this one. Are there any test? Now, are there any questions? Not immediately? No? Okay, then maybe I should do one.
Yeah, sure.
Have you done this thing you were talking about the developer portal as a tool to have like different audience sets? Have you seen this already in practice, or this is an idea that you had, or how did you come up with this idea? Is this something you've seen happening in a company you work with, or?
So I haven't seen it happen quite in this way that I described it. I've seen this kind of like pipeline automation in terms of like publishing your APIs, but really with its expectation that okay, this should be like a step at the end. And I was just thinking, okay, it really makes sense to, if you already use Git, if you have a pipeline for it and you have plugged this into your dev portal, I think this is a really great way. And I mean, I was thinking about like there's a lot of companies who try to build interest in products that haven't been released. Like they create landing pages, they collect emails for a newsletter because they're announcing products. And in the same way, why shouldn't we announce like new APIs, but already talk about the API design? Really, not just give some like fluffy description, but we say, okay, this is what we're building with. I think this is like a really great way to collect feedback for the API in the design stage.
I've seen some companies do like a get-together, like connected to hackathons also, but like get-together where they'll show their preliminary designs to a small group of external stakeholders even. So I've seen that happening in life. But I think it's an interesting idea to look at the portal as a way to expose that. Yep, thank you.
Okay.
Any questions? Yep, question? I've got a...
hello. So thank you for the presentation. I have one question related to, well, the different stakeholders that might not be aware of how Git works, etc. So they only review directly the API specification within the API portal. And I was considering a particular scenario where we have within only one API portal several API specification managed by different teams. So how would, well, let's say stakeholders that might not be aware of this organization request for a change because they say, well, I like this API, I would like to use it, but maybe there's something that is missing from my point of view, like a delete, like you shared. So what would be your advice to help this kind of stakeholders that might not be aware of the organization?
I think when you are like in a certain like big organizations, I'm sure it's like quite common that not every team knows what's like going on with like in every other team, and then I think that makes it like even more important to say, okay, you publish your APIs, but I think that's what I mentioned before. You still need to. I mean, just publishing it, it's like you build it and they come. It doesn't work. So you need to have like some way to make maybe like an internal blocker. So you need to make announcements or something. You really need to build this culture of like people should explore and find the new things. And then you need to make like very clear for every API like who's working on this, like whose team's responsibility is this, and what is the way to give feedback to that team if you want to work with it, but you want something changed. So you definitely, like where you don't work in Git, but you have it on your dev portal, your dev portal needs to implement some kind of feedback mechanism, and that can be as simple as like in OpenAPI, you can say like who's responsible for the API and give an email address, and you can say, okay, send the feedback to that person, or you could send up like something more sophisticated. But yeah, I don't have any specific suggestion how you should do this.